I'm a strong believer, and as I think Audrey is as well, in transparency. And I think that, as I said, there are some limits to freedom of expression. There's some limits on platforms, and there should be. But at the same time, I think that censorship, whatever form it takes, should always have some transparency component to it. People should have the right to know what those limits are and how they're being enforced. And so one of the ways in which we tried to hold companies accountable on this is something called the Santa Clara Principles on Transparency and Accountability in Content Moderation. And these first came out in 2018. They were created by a very small group of people, mostly US Americans, alongside a conference in Santa Clara, California. And this was really done on the fly. And as a result, I thought that first set was pretty good, not perfect. But as a result of this sort of throwing something out into the ether, of course, a lot of people had opinions on it. And we heard from a lot of our friends internationally in particular that there were things missing from those principles. And so we embarked on this process to put out a second version of them.
Hi, welcome to Innovative Minds. My pleasure to be here as your host. Just call me TaiwanPlus. This show is a forum for leaders in tech and politics to discuss how to solve today's problems with today's tools. Today, our special guest is Jillian York, Director for International Freedom of Expression at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I'm also here with Audrey Tang, Taiwan's Digital Minister. Today, we will discuss defending digital freedoms by navigating the complex issues of freedom of expression and content moderation. Okay, so before we get started, I want to introduce our two guests today. Jillian C. York is Director for International Freedom of Expression at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF, a non-profit organization dedicated to preserving civil liberties in the digital age. She is also a renowned writer, activist, and esteemed advocate for digital rights and freedom of expression. Hi Jillian, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Audrey Tang is Taiwan's Digital Minister. She became Taiwan's youngest minister without portfolio in 2016 when she headed the public digital innovation space. She has been a hacktivist for over 2 decades. She is also a promoter of open source innovation. Hi Audrey.
Good local time, everyone.
To start things off, Jillian, could you tell us more about your role at the Electronic Frontier Foundation and what this organization stands for?
Sure. So EFF's mission is to ensure that technology supports freedom, justice, and innovation for people all over the world. So we do that through a number of different ways. We work on litigation, activism, education, technology. My role is as Director for International Freedom of Expression. I've been in that role for, I think, 12 years now. And my work encompasses a range of things, mostly, of course, related to freedom of expression. But I do a lot of work organizing people internationally. I work on some of our educational efforts, interviewing people, talking to activists, bringing them together. And for many years now, I've specialized in content moderation and specifically looking at the ways that platforms govern speech, create policy, and how that impacts people all over the world.
Thank you. Jillian, the headquarters of the EFF is based in San Francisco, but you're an international organization present in many countries. How does your organization navigate the different legislations in the countries where it operates?
That's such a great question. I mean, the disproportionate impact of US and EU policy has been, a particular focus of mine for a long time. I'm based in Berlin. We've got a few people scattered throughout the world. I'll probably forget to name them all, but in Denmark, Peru, Brazil, the UK. And we do a lot of work in Latin America and in Brussels, and as well as in a few other places. And so I think, navigating all of those different areas it's a complex thing. We've got teams that work on majority world issues, teams that are working specifically on Brussels legislation. And then, of course, our US team does the majority of the litigation that we do in the US. And so there's certainly a lot of complexity there.
With that, I have a follow-up question. What are your opinions on legislation in a few countries disproportionately impacting the rest of the world?
Sure. So, I think that the disproportionate impact of different legislation comes across in a number of different areas. And I think that we should include company policies on this as well, because a lot of the companies that we're looking at, social media platforms, companies building AI, a lot of them are headquartered in the US. And so the decisions being made by their policymakers are decisions that are kind of attuned toward US needs and not always global needs. So that's an area where I've personally done a lot of work trying to bring international needs and activists into the conversations that companies companies and legislators are having. To give another more specific example, our work on the Digital Services Act, which is led by my colleague Christoph Schmann, is one of the things that he and his team have done is to bring in international human rights activists into something called the DSA Human Rights Alliance to ensure that their needs are also being met by this legislation, which, again, is being created by European lawmakers and in many ways is probably very good for Europeans, but not necessarily good for people living in under other governments.
I see. Now, I would like to ask Audrey, how does Taiwan promote participation of technologist activists and nonprofit organizations in public discussions on digital freedoms?
Yeah, that's a great question. Indeed, around the 10th century, our main idea is called 软体自由 or software liberty, meaning that people impacted by software should have the ultimate say in how to deploy such software. It's a very simple idea, but at the time, it was a struggle to get it accepted by the major governments in the world, let alone the Silicon Valley companies. We do have many allies at a point in Taiwan. Previously in this channel, we mentioned the National Academy in Taiwan, universities, and so on, that focus on this simple idea of letting the people who enjoy broadband as a human right to prototype simple systems that fits their neighborhoods use cases, their districts use cases, and so on. And that is probably called civic technology. And so my ministry is basically offering all sorts of ways to look at the cutting edge ideas that emerge from those civic technologies that solve the problem for specific neighborhoods, and then just to endorse it to ensure that we can scale it to national or even international level, and then takes what works on a smaller scale and work on a larger scale. For example, we work with the alignment assemblies movement around the world to let people in a small neighborhood talk about what they expect of generative AI, and then use those collective intelligence to tune their local open source AI models so that those AI models fits their expectations, not some random arbitrary company's expectations. There are also civic tech groups that focuses on community development, on listening to the local needs of people who need secure communication so that they can be whistleblowers or journalists or things like that. And in general, we just support them with not just funding, but also with resource and connections so that the GovTech and the CivTech world can eventually blur the lines and merge so that we translate the best of breed civic tech around the world, like the Zero Knowledge Privacy Authentication Framework, our IRMA from the Europe and many from UK and so on, and to use it in our everyday public sector work. So in short, the idea is to take civic technology and use them as public infrastructure.
Jillian, in March 2021 you published a book called Silicon Values: The Future of Free Speech Under Surveillance Capitalism. In that book you argue that social media platforms created in Silicon Valley, like Twitter or Facebook, create their own content moderation policies, and that this has a huge influence on how their users can, or cannot, express themselves. Fast forward to today, have things changed for the better or the worse over the past 2 years?
Yeah. It's such a great question. This is something that's been really near and dear to my heart for probably almost 15 years now. And when I started working on it, a lot of the companies based in Silicon Valley, even, Facebook, were rather small, at least comparatively. And so they, we had their ear, me, other activists, other people working in the space at think tanks and government as well. I think that around the time that my book came out, I was actually quite hopeful. That was when the Meta Oversight Board was being built. We were seeing Twitter's previous team really listening to people. And so it's actually really disappointing to see what's happened in the past couple of years since it came out. And a lot of that, of course, being since the January 6th insurrection in the US, but also a number of other global factors, of course. And so now what we're seeing is this era in which these sort of strong men like Elon Musk are coming out and, being very hypocritical in their approach. He said he was going to come and bring free speech to Twitter. But even just today, I saw an article about how he had a personal hand in kicking off an anti-fascist activist in the US. And of course, globally, I think maybe he's perhaps paying a little less attention, but I'm sure that we're going to see some stories come out about international folks being kicked off as well, possibly by Musk himself. At the same time, I don't want to focus solely on him. Of course, this has been really disappointing, but I would say there are a couple of other slight positives. I think, I've been very critical of Meta's oversight board, and yet at the same time, the decisions that the board itself has been putting out, the recommendations, are quite strong and based in international human rights frameworks. On the other hand, we've got, kind of a plurality of decentralized or federated networks coming out now, which is, and I'd be really curious to hear what Audrey thinks about that. It's something I've been excited to see. Of course, we're starting to see kind of some of the cracks and the problems inherent to moderating content on a decentralized platform as well.
Yeah, indeed. So as I mentioned, if the people in the same neighborhood, they care about the same thing very strongly, they already have a norm around what is considered contextual or appropriate speech and what is decontextualizing or inappropriate speech. So in the civic tech teams that we're currently working on, for example, in Taipei City, there's a team called Team Pedestrian Safety that works on addressing the road shortcomings when it comes to wheelchair accessibility and many other uses. They have their own culture of what counts, right, as appropriate speech in that regard. You can be very critical, right, to the road builders and things like that, as long as you speak in good faith. And we also have another in Taichung, I believe, a team that focuses on making the childcare easier. And again, this is a bunch of young parents or grandparents and so on, and that focuses on the service journey of getting the network of societal support, community support needed for all the things related to childbearing and also to access the government and civil society provided service in a streamlined and privacy-preserving fashion and so on. And they have their own culture as well. And I take time to describe such use cases because moderation is not in a vacuum. If we build a decentralized network based on people with very weak links, with basically just hashtag links, there is no shared context at all, and everybody will have to apply their own language model filter in order to understand each other's where they're coming from, the nuances. But from what we have seen, anything that is tied to a neighborhood of value, of shared purposes, tend to agree on code of conduct in a way that is not spelled out in those code of conduct words, but rather in the process of having a conversation around that code of conduct in a good faith way. And so I would say that a plurality of social networks works if and only if there is a corresponding strong link between the people involved in a neighborhood of values, if not in time and space, at least in the daily practices.
I completely agree with you. And I think that, when it comes to different different servers, for example, on Mastodon or different networks, I feel like I'm going to get the technology wrong here. But I guess my question for you here would be, do you think that that's scalable on a globally accessible platform? I think that Blue Sky for me, right, which I've been kind of playing around on, is such a good example of this because there is this network of people who are mostly, Twitter refugees, so to speak. But at the same time, we're starting to see bad actors come in. And I wonder how you would see that as being scalable or not.
Yeah, in Taiwan, we already saw a very large-scale social sector alternative scalable after all these years. The PTT, which I think stands for Professional Technology Temple, but not many people know that, is a place that's maintained by a student club for 25 years in the National Taiwan University. And so, again, it's arm's length, right? The Ministry of Education probably subsidizes a lot of its costs, but it cannot censor its speech being in a university. And because it serves no shareholders or advertisers, and all the code is open source. Over 25 years, they evolved their own self-regulation capabilities. People who participate the most has the access not just to the code of conduct, but also the code itself because it's open source. So I was just enrolling in the PTT's latest app testing, and they're also figuring out how to deal with deep fakes, people who can pass all the CAPTCHAs that people have worked with. But because they're in the social sector, they naturally choose zero knowledge and privacy preserving and non-censoring ways to do that. So I think Taiwan has shown that these things do scale, but it does need the technologies to take this as their purpose, their mission, not as an afterthought, like let's build something that scales and then add some civil liberties. That doesn't work.
I absolutely agree.
Jillian, what do you think of the development of decentralized platforms that meet the needs of specific communities?
I think I really agree with Audrey. I mean, I think that it's a positive trend in the sense that, creating different networks that have different sets of values is a good thing. I mean, I've been saying that for a long time. When we think about like niche communities, I used to use Ravelry, the knitting community, as a good example of this, where, they were one of the first platforms to kick off anyone who was supporting Donald Trump. And we're very open about that. And I thought, this is maybe a good future or a good model for the future. But, I think at the same time, sometimes when something's good for free speech, when you've got, platforms that have different sets of values, different supports, I think that there's also a loss here that we're not talking about as much. The loss of these centralized platforms for people to access a global community. I think about like the Egyptian Revolution, for example, the ways in which people were able to grab the attention of everyone through that, including journalists, including academics. And so there's definitely a loss for research, for global reach. And I think about the sort of connection here between freedom of speech and reach, which we talk about usually in a negative sense, but I think that there is this other side of it as well.
Yeah, indeed. Although I'm a little bit more optimistic for the interoperability between the various plurality of platforms, because after all, these are like very small datagrams, right? Even videos nowadays, it doesn't matter actually which network you upload to. If it goes viral across many networks, but it costs essentially nothing to store those videos, right? So I think as long as we have a good way for provenance, meaning that we know that this video comes from you and not a deepfake copy of you, I think it doesn't matter that you're on a different network between your network and mine. One good example is this very podcast, because the Innovative Minds podcast is Creative Commons, even though that currently it's uploaded mostly on the centralized platforms like YouTube or Facebook and so on. When people who want to see particular episodes, they cross-post it to other social networks because it created commons, and it says so on the video itself. So I think as long as the provenance is clear, there should be ways for people who are interested in starting a global reach to write code to accomplish that.
This brings us to the heart of the matter. I would like to ask Jillian to provide us with her definition of freedom of expression or freedom of speech, and explain why they hold such significance.
Oh, definitions so it's 9:30 in the morning here, I should say, and I'm still going on my first cup of coffee. So I'd forgotten to prepare to actually define the terms. So I think I'm going to start by differentiating them, and then we can get into it a little bit more. So freedom of expression and freedom of speech, I mean, I think that they are used interchangeably, but from my perspective, they're not interchangeable. I think that freedom of speech is actually kind of limiting. And for me, it's kind of a US American term. I mean, it's what's enshrined in our Constitution, and certainly other countries use it as well. Other people use it. But freedom of expression has always struck me as being the more expansive, inclusive, and global term. Global in the sense that it's what's used in international human rights frameworks, but I think expansive and inclusive in the sense that speech, verbal speech or typed speech, is not the only way of expressing oneself. I think we can view this through a lens of accessibility. Not everyone speaks, not everyone writes, but also through the lens of emphasizing the importance of imagery, of art, of movement, dance. I mean, all of these other ways of expressing ourselves. And for me, that's really important when we're talking about social networks, because I think that a lot of the first things that networks focus on limiting are imagery. I mean, when we're talking about things like nudity, sexual education, but also things like extremism, terrorism, companies seem to have had no problem in kind of going after imagery while emphasizing the importance of speech. And I do think that harms a lot of different communities.
Yeah, I mean, freedom of expression or 表现自由 exactly as Jillian has said, covers also nonverbal expressions, right? When we think about all the different ways, for example, people putting on a blue ribbon on their websites, that is speech, of course, but it also carries a freedom of assembly connotation to it by embracing the same meme together to form culture together. This is more than just a single like blue ribbon campaign manifesto, which was, by the way, the first internet activity that I joined. But also it creates a tribe of sorts, a kinship of sorts of people just riffing on it and creating like cultures and eventually leading to Creative Commons and many other important projects. And so the point I'm making is that culture itself, expression itself, tend to take on a life among people who have solidarity, who identify with each other. And freedom of speech, to me, is much more individualistic. It's like a person's speech, and you need to protect that person's way of seeing things and expressing things and so on. But freedom of expression, to me, is much more communal, much more societal.
I love that. I completely agree. And I love the mention of the Blue Ribbon campaign as well, which I'm not sure if everyone knows, but for online free speech and expression.
Yes.
Thank you to both of you for your insights. Now that we have a clear understanding of the topic and its significance, let's dive deeper into it. Jillian, let me ask you bluntly, do you believe that freedom of expression has any limits?
I do. And I mean, I think it's worth pointing out to start. First, I'm just going to say here that I'm speaking for myself as an individual. But at the same time, I mean, I would say that even US law sees limitations on freedom of expression. Of course, these are limitations that don't get talked about as much, but things on profanity, obscenity, or sorry, not profanity, mixing terms, obscenity, even, I think there's been consensus for a long time in the internet community that spam is not freedom of expression. And yet the censorship of spam can certainly result in the limiting of actual, legitimate speech as well. And so just moving on from those examples, I think from my perspective, I think that that freedom of expression does have limits, but I think that the issue around it is that censorship is always the blunt object that's used to limit freedom of expression. And often those in charge are not thinking of the impact that censorship and the methods used to do it will have. And so, I've never been a believer in, in these adages like "I'll fight for the right for," or I always forget the exact quote, but fighting to the death for someone's right to say something awful. That's not really where I'm coming from. My perspective has always been that that censorship harms people, and that it's something that we have to think about really carefully, and that power can be really harmful as well, and that those who are undertaking limits to freedom of expression are often those whose let me phrase this correctly, those for whom the loss of freedom of expression would not cause nearly as much harm as it does to the majority of people. Audrey, I'm really curious to hear what you think about that.
Yeah. So Taiwan has a history of martial law for 4 decades. When I was a child, my parents, both journalists, they were in this non-stopping tug of war with the censors by the state on what to print and what to not print. And so I think the people in Taiwan who are older than me, that's to say 40-somethings or older, remember censorship as a very, very blunt, very, very harmful weapon. On the other hand, people who are educated after the lifting of the martial law and the globalization of media and so on tend to be very, very accepting and use social media tools developed by other places in the world and without much nationalist thinking. And then people get exposed firsthand, of course, to the wonders and cultures of the world, but also the polarizing hate, the toxic speech, the all sort of very actually hard to imagine from the Taiwanese culture thing that is just part of the global internet when exposed to it. And so there are many young people who now say and think that some sort of moderation that we see in the community moderation platform that we see here, for example, PTT and so on, should be the default. And it's weird that those Silicon Valley companies don't think that a subreddit, right, a community self-moderation should be the default and instead relies on this global oversight board thing that tries to apply a ethic in a kind of globally applicable way. So I think Taiwan always have some sort of fear, uncertainty, and doubt around any power centralization, which is a very good thing. But we do see that some sort of content moderation, if it doesn't get escalated into a no opt-out model, but rather straightforwardly opted in and very well known by the community members, could be a useful thing, especially just to defend against the trolls that are focusing on the foreign information manipulation interference, which we also face every day. And according to VDEM, Taiwan is the highest target for such foreign meddling. So it's quite interesting that the younger people see some sort of defense is necessary, but the older people keeps reminding the young people, by the way, the state cannot monopolize such powers.
Yeah, no, I think we're seeing that in a lot of places. I mean, it worries me that doesn't get discussed as much in Europe. And I think that, I live in Germany where there's certainly been problematic censorship here. I mean, I think the insult law is a really great example of this. But at the same time, I mean, I think people of most generations agree in some way or another that censoring, positive views of the Holocaust, for example, is a good thing, regardless of how. And yet, I think, like, coming from an outside perspective, of course, I understand this country's sensitive history, but at the same time, I can also see from maybe a different perspective some of the harms that could come from blanket rules like that don't consider nuance, that don't consider even what the swastika image means to other cultures, for example.
Yeah, which is why I think the Taiwanese civil society focused, on a notice and public notice scheme instead of a notice and take down scheme when it comes to hateful speech. Because indeed, if you take it down, it leaves a vacuum for conspiracy theorists. And arguably, actually, it feeds into the hate, because then the haters can point to the censorship and see there is a conspiracy that stops us from talking about these things. On the other hand, the contextualization services provided, for example, by the COFACTs, are language model based. It's now a AI, assistive intelligence, doing the contextualization, but the model is not imported. It is rather trained by the GovTech and Civic Tech communities, the G0V community in particular. So the people who care about such things get to train their own models, and people who don't like this labeling or this contextualization can simply fork and create their own service that adds such labeling to potential hate speech and things like that. And I think at the end of the day, what we are looking for is a forkable way of content moderation, so that when people like the way, for example, to address the hate that you just mentioned around ethnic groups and so on, they can also tailor-make it to their particular local context without subscribing to all the block lists. So if you use advertisement blockers, they have this community, right? You can subscribe to the block list from all the different jurisdictions, but you can also override it, and it tends to have the subcultures each saying, actually, we want to stop tracking, and even the so-called benign forms of tracking, de-identified form of tracking, let's just block it all. And whereas there's community that says, no, let's not do that, let's do this instead, but they share the same technical infrastructure.
The contextualization provided by large language models within different communities seems to be a sustainable solution that doesn't require outright censorship. Moving forward, Jillian, could you explain to us what content moderation is?
Sure. So, I mean, content moderation, it takes on a number of different forms, but it's basically the process of moderating expression or speech, which kind of fit under this umbrella of content. I don't love that term, for the record, but it's the term we use, from the internet. So usually this is spoken about in the form of, or when we're talking about platforms, whether centralized platforms or decentralized platforms, federated networks, networks owned by Elon Musk, whatever we're talking about. And the process that this takes is typically through a notice and takedown or notice and action method. What that means practically is usually that users flag content to someone, traditionally or historically, this has been in a centralized way. So they're flagging content to a platform's policy teams or to their trust and safety teams. And then that content or that expression is considered against a set of rules and either removed or moderated in some way. And these other ways, other than just removal, are take the form of things like demonetization, deranking, and probably a large range of other things these days as well, which are not always transparent. So I'm a strong believer, and as I think Audrey is as well, in transparency. And I think that, as I said, there are some limits to freedom of expression. There's some limits on platforms, and there should be. But at the same time, I think that censorship, whatever form it takes, should always have some transparency component to it. People should have the right to know what those limits are and how they're being enforced. And so one of the ways in which we've tried to hold companies accountable on this is something called the Santa Clara Principles on Transparency and Accountability in Content Moderation. And these first came out in 2018. They were created by a very small group of people, mostly US Americans, alongside a conference in Santa Clara, California. And this was really done on the fly. And as a result, I thought that first set was pretty good, not perfect. But as a result of this sort of throwing something out into the ether, of course, a lot of people had opinions on it. And we heard from a lot of our friends internationally, in particular, that there were things missing from those principles. And so we embarked on this process to put out a second version of them. It was quite a long process. We invited groups from all over the world to submit comment. We worked with a large number of people and groups, again, internationally as well, to create a new set of principles that would work for more people. And of course, when you've got that many people working together, you're going to get something interesting. And in this case, quite long. But I think that they're pretty great. And really, they focus on a few key areas. So we've got foundational principles and practical ones. And we're looking at things like human rights and due process, ensuring that that's incorporated into policymaking and content moderation processes, ensuring that the rules are understandable to everyone, that there's cultural competence in moderation. This is something, hearkening back to a prior part of this discussion, ensuring that people, understand the language, culture, and political and social context of the posts that they're moderating. And so on a centralized platform, this is a really difficult thing to ensure happens, but it's also something that platforms have really historically not done a very good job of. You've got people in other countries moderating speech in places where they don't understand the local context or how certain words are used or what certain expressions might mean. Imagery, et cetera. And then we also look at things like state involvement, content moderation, integrity and explainability. And we're really looking at, making sure that platforms are publishing things like numbers of what they remove, context around what they're removing, notice to users, and ensuring that platforms have strong appeals processes when content is removed or moderated.
Yeah, what I like about the Santa Clara Principles now at 2.0 is that it was co-created by a truly multi-stakeholder group. That is to say, it is not like just one side of human rights activists like lobbying or advocating for this principle. It is also the intermediaries. It is also the governments and so on. So I think it is very nuanced and balanced, and we have successfully apply the principles in many of the important decisions. For one example, in Taiwan, we do have a way to block the DNS, that's the domain name, from resolving if it can be proven that it is a criminal like scamming activity or a website that transmits computer virus code that infects your computer when you visit it and things like that. But while the law enforcement agencies and also the e-merchants that gets cloned, copied by those scammers can set this kind of flags so that those domains are reported. It is actually up to each ISP to whether to enforce that policy zone or not. And the way that they communicate is nowadays through open data. You can actually every day see new domains being flagged and where they're flagged, was the appeal process and things like that. And And for the end users, if you are so determined, or if you're a cybersecurity researcher that do want to, visit those domains, you can just point to a different DNS server. That's all it takes, right? So this kind of multi-stakeholderism is a stark contrast with many other jurisdictions where essentially running your own DNS server is forbidden and you must adhere to certain firewall rules. So I think the existence of such multi-stakeholder precedents and principles provides a much easier start of conversation for any domestic conversations around here, especially of the importance of cultural competence and cultural sensitivity that Jillian just mentioned.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that they've been useful.
They are.
From what I hear, any kind of limits on freedom of speech must at the very least have a clear legal basis, and must be a necessary and proportionate means of achieving a legitimate goal. Thank you both for participating in this dialogue. Together, we have deciphered some fundamental notions of public debate. And if you like today's episode, be sure to subscribe, share, and let us know what you think. See you next time on Innovative Minds.
I would say that, I really agree with what Audrey just said, that it's often the actors and the methods that matter a lot more than the speech itself. I mean, of course, we have to look at what's being said. But I think that, one of the key things here is that when you or I or any average citizen, although, maybe you're not so average in your role, but when any average citizen shares something that's misinformation, they're often not doing so from a malicious perspective. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Also have to consider the impact of what it means when, my aunt or uncle shares something on Facebook that, let's say, misinformation about vaccines. Why are they doing that? Is it because they've also been duped, and by whom? And so it's those large actors, the bad actors, the ones who are intentionally misleading people that we should be focused on. And so, when I look at, there was a great article and ensuing campaign a couple of years ago about the top actors sharing vaccine misinformation. Now, I'm really interested in the issues around health and medical misinformation because I think that there are really two sides of this story. Strong believer in vaccines, I should say that to start out. But when we're looking at this, we're looking at these intentional bad actors, this group of them that have been spreading this information for what? For profit. And that's something that we need to consider. Hi, I'm Jillian York, EFF's Director for International Freedom of Expression. See you on TaiwanPlus.
Hello, I'm Audrey Tang, Taiwan's Digital Minister. See you on TaiwanPlus.